Just waiting for it. Hello, everybody. My name is David Sherdewan, and I have Joe Banner here with me, and we're going to do a quick retrospective of Bone Marshes. We're going to talk about our thoughts now that the project's over, some of the things that we wish we'd done, or some hangups that we had. And we're also going to talk about when or if you should go back and do revisions. So if a bunch of people find typos in your book, or if there's some major print errors, when do you go back and go through the trouble of fixing all those, or when do you just leave it alone and hope that people figure out what you meant to say? So, hey, Joe, how you doing?
I'm all right. Yeah. Yourself?
I am a lot better. Finally recovered, and I've been excited to have this meeting and talk to you and sort of express our thoughts and feelings now that there's no time pressure and everything is done.
Yeah, it's nice. It's funny to have had a couple of weeks because there's been a couple of the steps, hasn't there, where we were trying to get something sorted. But the longer it's gone, the nicer it's been actually to reflect on it a little bit. And I know that there's been a few more bits coming through that have given us something more to talk about in the interim. So yeah, it's good. It's all right.
So I don't have my copy, but Joe, just to prove to everybody that we did finish Bone Marshes.
Doesn't even have its own copy. Unbelievable. So here it is. Here is the finished copy. It has its own barcode. It's all good. My one is printed, I believe. So mine will be the UK printing, of course, but I suppose yours won't be. So my little ones say printed in Milton Keynes, which is about 150 miles away from me.
Oh, cool.
And that'll be the one. That'll be what you'll see if you get it anywhere. I assume anywhere except the US. As far as I know, even in places like Japan or Australia, I don't think they use the US printing for that. I'm not sure. But yeah, so this will be it. This is the finished one.
All right.
Yeah, looking pretty sharp.
So Joe, since you did a lot of the design work and you sort of brought everything together at the end. I did the writing, Alex did the artwork, but you were sort of the one, especially towards the end there, doing a lot of the work and a lot of the effort. So I guess, how do you feel about Bone Marshes?
I think it's an interesting project. I feel like there's been very few downs and a lot of ups. I'm really happy with the project overall, actually. I feel like we did things I've liked in particular. I like that we did you and I did a lot of groundwork at the start. And I liked that as a designer coming to me with your idea. I like that your brief was quite clear, quite specific. The main thing that comes to my mind is the size of the project. You were quite clear from the outset that you wanted a nice big project, a nice big booklet that would sit flat on the table. So here you can see it actually sits flat, and you can use every spread, and we've got lots of space on every single spread, be it for nice pictures, something to spark the imagination, or informative diagrams, or cool illustrations, or just walls of text, just whatever we need. And we've got it to hand. Now, my personal preference from stuff I've designed previously is actually to go quite small. I like the idea of having stuff in my pockets. So that was quite new for me. That was, I don't know if it was a challenge per se, but like it was definitely like a new experience for me to try and get into that mindset. But I really enjoyed it once we started. So for me, one of the things I really like is how you've been able to state your case, and we've worked with that, and it's worked, in my mind, I think it's worked pretty well. Yeah,
this is also true for me as well. Normally, I design the game first, do the text and the writing, and then the layout and the format is all secondary. Like, oh, we'll put it in a 6x9 booklet. We'll put it in a 8.5 by 11 soft cover. But this was the first project I've done where the format and the medium were of prime importance. And we actually talked about that before a lot of the content and the mechanics and the system and the setting. So that's true. That's a really good point. It was fun to work on, because then we could make everything we wrote and worked on after that fit into the format we had picked.
Yeah, and it was, I think that's an easy trap to fall into, isn't it, of doing the layout last. It's like I remember when I was doing media studies at school, and you always did the soundtrack last. And then, anyone who's grown up to be a sound designer, it's like, whoa, what are you doing there? Don't do that. Like, you want to try and it's never possible to integrate absolutely everything. Delays are inevitable. Nothing quite will go along in exactly the order you want it to. But by keeping everything ticking over, I think that's a really nice way to both keep the pressure up in a good way on the project, to keep everyone kind of invigorated and kind of excited about what's going on in a project which can last months. That's not an easy thing. If you're writing, what did we do in the end? We made 48 pages, I think was the final count. Yeah, 48 or 47 technically, because with Drive Through RPG, you have to leave the last page blank anyway. So a 47-page book, large, but so maybe the equivalent of what might be a 100-page book elsewhere. But, it's a lot of content, but it's also not so much that you are constantly kind of making sweeping changes to it, right? It's not as if there was, in this project, it wasn't one of those ones where there's vast swathes of like, oh, well, I need to do this whole chapter later, right? I'm not going to gather the bestiary later. The bestiary was small enough, as was the other aspects, that it all comes together quite well, and quite quickly. So it's very much been worked as a kind of a very nice self-contained project. And I think that's as an idea to move forward, certainly for my sake, I'm thinking, yeah, that's how I'd want that kind of mindset to go. Be it for something that's a Kickstarter related thing where your schedule is relatively well set. I mean, you would hope that there's some wiggle room, but we're not talking about a lot of wiggle room. We want to set your dates and keep to them as closely as possible, to the day if possible, but to the week if not. So that's not a lot of wiggle room, even for a project which is quite self-contained. So it's nice to have that kind of schedule, and I think the way that this project worked out was a good reflection in that.
I agree. And in fact, on my end, this was the first project where I was heavily involved in the graphic design and layout. And Joe was kind enough to let me sort of piggyback, be involved to watch his process. We have a couple other hangouts on this YouTube channel where we go through that. But for me, this was like my first major foray into graphic design and layout. And I'm excited that I had that opportunity to work alongside you, Joe, and I'm hoping I can take that into future projects. Everything that I've learned that I was able to practice on Bone Marshes. So it was almost like a mini college course for me in that regard, which was a neat experience. I've never had a project be like that before.
Yeah, well, I'm very interested to see what comes next from yourself in that regard as well. So it'll be cool to see what lessons you've taken forward and how that's gone. I think I've recognized some elements even from through the context of this project. I can think back to how the layouts looked, even though nothing changed radically. But I think that there was certainly a non-zero amount of things, and even things that we might have thought at the start of project we quite well set in stone. I'm thinking things like the hex maps, for example. Actually, the hex maps and the regions around those individual sections, things like these sections right here, even these hex maps. Well, even those got iterated more than you might expect over the course of sort of the two months, say, like the 6 to 8 weeks that we were quite heavily working on that aspect of the project. So I think that there's definitely been an evolution in your work, which has been really fun to see. And I like working with you, Dave. Like, I feel like we're on the same wavelength in a lot of project work. So it's fun to have someone on board who's curious and asking questions. And it's good. It's a good way to work. From a designer's perspective, I think it's a good way to work. If talking to other designers who might be starting out or just starting in RPG related work, maybe you're just starting out in layout for the first time, or illustration, or movie design for Kickstarter, trailers, that sort of thing, whatever. But if you've got a client who's going to be keen and interested in actually taking on some of those skills themselves, and they want to see that working, I'd hang on to them because it's worth it, and you get more of a fun project. It's more creative overall. A shared creative experience is more beneficial overall, and I think that's a really good way to go about doing it.
And I think that the other nice benefit is that going forward, any sort of bad or sloppy design work that I produce can be attributed directly to you, Joe.
Yeah, well, quite. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. So let's jump into pitfalls. So what sort of things would we be keeping an eye out for going forward in a future project or similar projects, and what sort of threw us for a loop?
Yeah, what threw us for a loop? I wouldn't say it threw us for a loop per se. In a way, I'm not sure if any one thing really threw. I don't think I felt anything through us or me for a loop. We had timelines. Timelines was something that we obviously wanted to manage, and that was something that's quite new for me. There's elements where, as I said earlier, you don't want to be delaying on any of these aspects. And sometimes if you've got some of the assets ready to go and others not, there's that hurry up and wait. So there's that trying to balance that sense of excitement with the anxiety of will everything come through and is it going to look the part on time? And you've got to balance that against a certain sense of calm that, well, we've planned for this, we've factored this is all actually according to plan. You know, it's nice to feel like, oh wow, maybe we'll be ahead of schedule, or maybe we'll, you know, be on time, or whatever. But actually, it's okay to be on the schedule too. And if things delay, then things delay. You know, these things do happen. So long as it isn't anything that's so significant, then I don't think that's a huge deal. So I think that kind of sorting out the timelines was certainly a challenge to try and keep that in here, to try and keep that managed, and to stay kind of cool with that and just tick along. And the other thing, looking now that I've got the finished project, and we will talk about this a little bit when we're talking about revisions in a bit, because revisions is certainly another factor. But now that I've actually got the full finished product, obviously you print out and you use print proofs as you go. But having the actual bound copy and seeing how the drive-through product feels, I feel like my inexperience with the larger size books, even though I've got experience with the smaller size books, about 5x7, which are very similar in terms of the print quality and the formatting. There's little things I would change if I was to do the whole thing again. There's little things I would change with the layout. For example, the book itself, going to like by the stapled spine, the book very naturally, you can see the kind of curve there. Hello, there it is. You can see it kind of falls to the center. And at the center, we've got part of the bestiary. So it's not the worst thing for the book to naturally fall to, but I think maybe that could have been a good space for the map, or something that's going to be a critical tool, what might have been a handout otherwise, even the core rules potentially. So I feel like to do it again, and something I would come back to is actually you could have spent even more time on the design and layout work. We could have gone even as much as time as we did spend on it. We could always have gone further. And I think that's a fun part of the process to a greater extent, and you can do that. But then of course the trade-off is, well, where do you end? Where do you finish? You know, you can be iterating and proofing and theorizing for as long as the cows come home, but sooner or later you have to draw the line. And I'm quite happy overall with where the line was drawn on this project. I feel like the line is, if this side of the scale is where we had to draw the line and make a lot of compromise, and this side of the scale is we had to draw the line and not make many compromises, you know, I'd say we're about here. We're at sort of 70% odd, you know, it's even more, 70, 80, 90 even. There's very little that we had to compromise in terms of what we started with as an idea and what we ended up with.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's important to keep in mind that the purpose of this little meeting is to nitpick and plan and try to improve. Both of us are very happy with Bone Marshes. It's gotten excellent reviews. It's selling pretty well. I'm super happy with it. I'm proud of what we've made.
Yeah.
But I always like to see what we can improve next, because that's how you get better. That's how things get more innovative, and our products get even more revolutionary. So, I mean,
turning it on its head somewhat, away from the design side, what do you think in terms of the content? Because obviously you did all the writing on Bone Marshes. So with that out in the wild now and getting reviews and being played, you know, most important of all, what's your thoughts on that? Is there any pitfalls that you found with the writing that you might take into the next sort of project?
Well, I haven't seen a ton of reviews aside from the 10-foot pole by Bryce Lynch. And I'm very proud of that review. He reviewed it very positively, which shocked and delighted me. But one of the things that he pointed out that was interesting was how much flavor he said. He said that like the NPCs had a lot of personality, where I always felt I was being kind of minimalist. I wish I'd had more space, more room to flesh things out. And so that was sort of an interesting lesson, that less is more, because a good GM will take a minor detail and improve upon it and build their own imagination upon it. I've been seeing that a lot with Ultraviolet Grasslands by Luca Rejek. Next to every NPC, he has maybe 3 or 4 words, and that's enough for me to roll in game. So that was sort of an interesting lesson to me, is that the minimalist, like constrained word limit and page limit forced me to cut a lot of content and simplify a lot of descriptions, and that made the project a lot stronger and a lot more usable at the table. So yeah, a lot of my fears actually ended up being pluses, which was a nice surprise.
We played with that a little bit, didn't we? I remember that the idea of getting these details quite minimalist, we went, I wouldn't say we go back and forth too much, but certainly we revised it a little bit in terms of the NPCs and having the very lightweight mechanics of Knave. So, for example, the details in terms of the hit dice and everything is always a one-line description underneath. So we're able to bolt those core statistics were able to be bolted on quite quickly, which left you as much or as little space as you wanted in order to write those details. And that could be quite freeing in some places. But then, of course, we realized as we worked on and realized that, well, that isn't as much room as you might think. It's a huge spread, but it's not so huge. So actually that had to start getting cut down. Or even more than that, when we started playing with the hex descriptions, I thought that was most interesting in terms of how that was, because we had to push that a little bit. I remember, I feel like I pushed back on that a little bit, where we've tried to get the formatting into those very core descriptions. So picking this one at random, the geode half, for example, you've got the large boulder there. And it's like, well, how much description do you put in there? Because you understand what a large boulder is. But the important thing in the context of that is describing what the context of that large boulder is doing there and why that's important to the players. And you're right, the GM can and almost certainly will draw the right conclusions, provided you give them the right impetus. So 3 or 4 words is great, provided they're the right 3 or 4 words. And like you say, I think that's been a really good practice in that regard. I think that there's a few of these have changed over the way, and I remember I've gone through a few of them, and it's good, it's fun.
The other thing that was interesting and that I didn't realize until the game was out, and I received a couple questions about it, was it was difficult to include the handouts because we didn't have the page count to include them in the book itself.
Indeed.
But the game really does rely heavily on a lot of those handouts for, armor descriptions, caravan inventory. And even though we put several references to the text, I realized at the end of the day, it's very possible someone will buy Bone Marshes, read it, and then have no idea where a lot of things are because that information is contained within the handouts. So that was sort of an interesting disconnect that I didn't really plan on.
True.
Because I'm the kind of person who, when I buy something, I go to the website, I download character sheets, I do a ton of research, and I love that stuff. That's why I made it for Bone Marshes. But a lot of people just want to buy the book and jump into the game. And so that was an interesting design constraint I would consider next time. I'd probably want to include the handouts in the book in like the back pages somewhere.
Yeah, because it's that strange challenge of like, I'm similar. It's like, well, if I need to get those details, I don't want them cluttering up my book. But actually, it's not so much a clutter potentially. Other people may not feel that way for a start, and it's a perfectly legitimate feeling to be that way because it is useful to reference and it is useful for it to all be in the book in one hit. But as a design standpoint, I find that it's like, oh, well, we've got this basically complete layout element. How much work do we need to do to actually insert that in? That's a whole page we're wasting. Like, what do we have to take out as a result of putting that in? Or do we increase the size of the whole thing? That's a pretty significant challenge. I suppose, again, going right back to the start and starting again, the challenge might be to actually redesign those elements in such a way that you can build them into the core content of the book. You can reflect them more specifically. I don't even know where we'd start with that, but I suppose having your kind of Bone Marshes flavored character sheets and then from those character sheets, the content kind of pulling on into the core rules or some of Azimek's flyer, for example, would be quite useful. I mean, there's all sorts of ideas you can have in retrospect, but yes, I guess the integration of those things really, and the real emphasis on the word integration there, not just addition, is an important thing for us both to take forward. Yeah.
Because I think we ended up with like 13 pages of handouts, something crazy. I mean, there's no way we could have fit those into the 48-page book, but it's an interesting omission that, for me, that would help me run the game. I would look at the handouts, in the last pages and be like, what's the point? I'm not going to photocopy these. They're just taking up space in the book. But to a lot of other people, that doesn't exist. The handouts just don't exist unless they go online and look it up, It's
a question of value, I guess, isn't it? It's like, do these additions to the core book, how much value do they add? And I think because of both of our tendencies as game players, not so much designers or writers, the tendency is to say, no, they don't add value. The additional cost that would be caused by the addition of 13 pages to this book, bearing in mind that the 50-page mark is sort of your cutoff point anyway. You still 48 pages anyway. So for anyone who's not done printing on Drive for RPG, you know, 48 pages is very much your cutoff point. After that, it's like, well, it may as well be 64 pages, right? So or 72 or 80 or whatever. So is it, how much value are we adding on relative to the cost which is going to be added to that product anyway? And in our minds, not so much, but to other people's minds, an awful lot. And that's notwithstanding the fact of whether or not they actually download it or not. Obviously, if someone was literally to get the book and say, oh, well, where do I get these details from? Well, it is in the book. To clarify, on the very first page on the credits, we do say quite clearly character sheets and handouts available via David's site. So it's not as if they aren't in there or aren't referenced at all. However, yes, we certainly going forward, it's something to more integrate in and say, well, additional content is available on, but the core content is available in this book. That's highlighted the value of that.
Yeah, it's an interesting, because of the digital world that we live in. I mean, how many people are just going to buy the PDF anyway, and they'll be accustomed to digital files. So it's an interesting idea.
That's also a reflection of it being a Kickstarter rather than a straight up release. Say, like if you wanted to release this on Itch.io, say, or just draw on Drive for RPG or any channel, whatever, it could have just been a straight digital product. It's out there, it's out in the wild, people are playing it, people are testing it, and that could have been the end of it. But and in those instances, it is, I would think, more likely that people will just pick up the digital copy, pick up the PDF for an idle read. I know that's my general inclination. But when it's a Kickstarter, it's a different story. When it's a Kickstarter, well, by virtue of you, our gracious buyers, actually, you know, putting your money down as a Kickstarter, as a forward payment, effectively, that does give a lot more flexibility, a lot more freedom to say, right, well, let's really make something creative with this project. Let's really build this into the project we want it to be printed. And how's that going to look printed? How's that going to look unprinted? So you're able to, as a Kickstarter, you're able to lean into that in a way that you wouldn't be able to do through other distribution and sales channels.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's jump into the last point of discussion. This is the interesting one, the main reason I wanted to talk to you and brainstorm, because this is something I hadn't ever really thought about. Most of my products, I hired someone to do the layout, like for Mythic Mortals or Clink. Someone else does the layout, and then that's it. If I want them to fix a typo on page 47, that's going to be $100 to bring them back on board and get them to open it up. But now that I've learned a bit of layout myself, and you and I have a much more, like, you know, casual relationship, I can say, hey, Joe, let's open this up, let's knock this out. So that brings up the question, now that I have the capability to do typo fixes and revisions, when is it worth going through, fixing a bunch of typos, redoing layout, resubmitting to the print process, checking the print copy, letting all the backers know there's an updated version? Should people buy a new one when they already have the old one? What do you think about all that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of points to that question. I think, long story short, TLDR, I would say, yes, I think it is worth, if at all possible, it is worth it. That's the short answer, because why not, right? Like, we live in a digital age. Going back to our last conversation, yes, people do own the physical copies, the print copies. They have the first printing, you know, warts and all. And yes, I think that leaves the door open for revised copies. In my mind, I like the idea that, well, let's say I bought into a Kickstarter and the print version had a couple of errata, had a couple of problems. Fine, that happens. And then if I wanted to know the revised elements, assuming those weren't too grand, it's a nice to know that the PDF is a revised version of that same file. So I've got the core product, and I know I've spent my money, and I know my money has not been wasted in that I helped make this, right? I helped make this print product. It wouldn't have happened at all. I wouldn't have anything. I wouldn't have a PDF, a print. I wouldn't have a character sheet if I hadn't made my initial investment anyway. So for additional errata, I think that if it can happen, I think it's a good thing to happen. And I know as a consumer, I do appreciate it. That being said, I mean, you gave the example earlier, like if you'd gone to a designer, then it's like, well, if I have to open up the InDesign file again, then it's $100. It is. It's, you know, we're not talking about just opening up the file as a rule. You know, if there's errata to be made, then there's an excuse there. There's an opportunity to go back and really revise it. If it's just to turn an into an A, No, it's not. It's not worth $100 for that, is it? No one's going to say it is. Or if people out there do, then come tell me and David on Twitter, and we'll up the price of Bone Marshes by like $50 if you think that's worth it. We won't mind. But I don't think it is. But I do think that after a few weeks have gone by and a few tweets have happened and a few reviews have come in, then there might be an opportunity to come back to that core vision and go, okay, well, we did miss a few things. Maybe this is worth it. Maybe we'll both feel a little bit happier. We're both creative folk and we both feel like this is something that's worthwhile. If in those instances, I think it's a very good idea. I mean, I was saving this for you, David. I found a mistake on the first page, right? We've made a mistake technically because my intent was not to have the cover repeated in color. That was not my intent. And that's why there's a white border there. But our intent in the actual print copy, and this is because of the versions that were sent over, so it was my mistake, and it's the best possible mistake that could have happened, all things considered, isn't it? Because after all, it doesn't actually change from the aesthetics or anything else. But yeah, my intent was to have a black and white replication of the Bone Marshes on a plain white page. That's what I like to do. That's my nice little trick. I like that a lot. That's what's supposed to be on page 1. So technically, all of these are wrong from the first page. So you guys know, so anyone who's bought it, you're good. You got the collector's edition. Good for you.
That's right.
Well done. Right?
That's right.
So there you are. Now, I suppose if we were to do a revised version, and that revised version included everything we've just talked about, so it added 13 pages plus of content, well, by that stage, we're starting to get into a slightly different product in its own right. So that might be a cause for considering a redux or a reprint version or something like that. I don't have a straight answer for you. I couldn't tell you where you might draw the line on such a process. Personally, in my mind, I'm thinking, well, you know, a dozen pages, at least, maybe even half a dozen pages is probably enough to warrant adding, you know, starting to make a revision. Yeah, I suppose it's a case of, as we call in the UK, in for a penny, in for a pound, right? If you're going to revise if you're going to add 6 pages worth of content, well, why not go the whole hog and add 12? And then yes, the price will probably increase as a result of that, but you'll be getting more content. And that's not to say that people who had already committed to the Kickstarter, of course, would be favored in that. So, you know, I don't know how you'd want to do that, David. That'd be up to you. I'm not going to put words in your mouth at that point, but I think there's options there, isn't there, regardless, for previous consumers and new consumers alike. I think that making sure the best possible result there is something that's very doable in this digital age, and I think, you know, quite noble. I mean, I think of, so I play a lot of Warhammer, right? And Games Workshop, the company that makes Warhammer, they've adopted a process of releasing their army books, the books which contain the rules for your Space Marine armies or Eldar or whatever. They release the core book, the Codex, and then they have quite a specific schedule of when they will release FAQs and errata. It is a known thing. It's guaranteed. They will say, they strongly imply that there will be issues with these prints, be it spelling errors or mistakes or stuff that needs to be revised. And I'm just going to close my window. Oh. And as a result, there we go. And as a result, we've got a schedule for that. So good news, right? Yes and no, because they're such a big company, these things have to come in a very specific time, in a very specific fashion. And it also means that when you're playing a big game, when you're playing your game involving bringing, you know, hundreds of figures to the table, and your big hardback book, your nice collector's edition book that you wanted to get, which is now almost null and void because you've got a separate stack of printed out sheets of paper, which is almost as big to errata what the original. So there it starts to get a bit messy. But with the Bone Marshes or products like this, indie RPG products in general, it's not the case, is it? We're talking about a handful of extra pages and a new PDF that you can download. You, the consumer, can download to your heart's content at your heart's content. You can do it whenever you like. You can do it as soon as it comes out if you want to make sure you've got the absolute cutting edge version of it, or you can wait and do it when it's relevant at the table or whatever. But I mean, to recap, I'm rambling again, but to recap, I would say that I'm happy with the release of the book. And if nothing were to change in the book, I think I would continue to be happy with it. That being said, there's always things that can be changed, and we could change those, and we may well change those because we have the means to do so. If we did, and there was a significantly changed product in its own right as a result, well, that might prompt a revision in terms of costs and presentation, shall we say. But as it is, if we're just changing what's already there, not so much.
Yeah, I'm pretty much on board with everything you said, Joe. I agree that if you're changing a couple small typos on 3 pages, then it's not a big deal. It's worth doing. But a complete redesign is probably beyond the scope of the Kickstarter funding that we have. What's interesting is that I come from a software design background, and with software, usually, especially small projects, it's very easy to update and fix something. If there's a typo on my website, I'm just going to fix it and deploy it. But for a print copy, even with the ease of print on demand through drive-through, there's we have to submit new files, wait 2 to 3 weeks to get the print copy, confirm that the typo is fixed, that things are the way we want it to, alert everybody that there has been a change, all that kind of stuff. So it's a bit more of a hassle to fix a typo on Bone Marshes than I'm used to. And the part of me that says fix it immediately, I have to sort of restrain and take a step back and say, is it worth it? So to use a real example, one of the suggestions that I received was more connections between the handouts and the book. So for example, at one point I referenced the caravan inventory handout, but on the actual handout itself, I had caravan inventory along the top, and I had to remove that to make room for all the content. So do we change that in the Bone Marshes? Do I redesign the handouts again? Should we maybe like specifically name, page 6 handout in the Bone Marshes to increase the connection between the text and the handouts? Maybe every single time we reference it, we include the hyperlink so that the connection is reaffirmed for people, so they click it and go look at it. But on a print copy, hyperlinks don't matter. So I've got a list of maybe a dozen small changes, and some are not so small. Like one of the interesting things that the Bryce Lynch review brought up is that in spite of my description as the marshes burning up and being on fire, none of the locations describe fire. My thought was that all of the random encounters, a lot of the random encounters contain fire, and there's rules for fires to spread, but I wanted everything to sort of start fresh and allow fires to be an organic result of the gameplay. But I've received not only that review, but a couple people asking, where are all the fires? If I don't run the encounters the exact way you've written in the book, there might not be any fires in the Bone Marshes, which is kind of weird. So would it be worth going back and, maybe 4 or 5 locations adding in, there is a fire here, sort of just to clarify that theme. And Joe, you and I will probably have like a private email discussing what it would cost and what the fee would be to change all these things. But it's an interesting thing to think about is like,
well, if I know it's $100 just to do a typo, then, get those Kickstarter buttons ready.
That's right. We'll run a Kickstarter to fix some typos.
No, but seriously, yeah, as you say, yes, it's
an interesting thought.
Yeah, and I think another interesting thing that comes to my mind is, the Bone Marshes was something that was play tested by you at length. So I playtesting for me personally as a writer, as a games designer rather than layout designer. I struggle with like, well, how much playtesting is enough playtesting? How much do we need? How much can I do? Because I'm only one person, and playtesting your own product is always, if not often at least, but almost always bias. So you've got that difficulty to work through as well. And so how do you incentivize playtest and all the rest of it? Playtesting is perhaps one of the most laborious parts of the process for me, in as much, even though ironically it's like you get in because you enjoy gaming, and yet gaming is different from playtesting. That's like, both things involve keys, but writing a maths dissertation is different from playing the piano, right? They're different things. So I think that, but nevertheless, you play tested this at length, and as a result of that, and your process is good. This is not your first rodeo. You've written plenty of books, released plenty of books to great success, or at least some success, and they're good. So in your estimation, in your kind of official, in your professional estimation as a games writer stroke playtester, the content that you wrote was broadly enough for your games, right? Actually, the content did not, sure, maybe the content didn't reflect the on fire state of the Bone Marshes, which is described in the description. I absolutely take those review points on board, and I don't disagree. But it's interesting that actually didn't have a strong impact in your game, and whether that's a reflection of how the writing has changed the playtest process. And then going beyond that, it's like, well, okay, so we could add some more pages, we could add some more content here, there, and everywhere. How much of that are we going to end up doing before we've actually gone all the way back to basics and we're basically writing the Bone Marshes Part 2? I mean, I've done this in part with a adventure of mine, which I know is dear to your heart, is the Planar Vault. Is that the Planar, my Patreon adventure, the Planar Vault, which David originally funded, bless him, indirectly via my Patreon. That's one of my favorites, and I know it's one of his. And we've gone through 3 iterations of that now. So in terms of my personal process when coming to a decision like this, and this is as much based on personal preference and feedback, and maybe rerunning the adventure again to get that. I've ended up saying, right, well, look, that was Plain Artful edition, again, the digital idea. This is version 0.5 or 1.0, and then the next edition is like, well, look, this is 1.5, and then the final version of that one wasn't in Patreon. It was actually in my Mercasa, my setting guide, my whole book. It was one of the core adventures in a larger book which contains a lot of similar stories. So that one you would at least hope is the definitive edition, but of course it never ends. You can keep iterating till the cows come home. So which one of those is the most iterative edition? Is the latest one? You'd think so, but then people have had plenty of fun with the first edition. And yes, people will go back to Bone Marshes. Sure, people have talked about, well, where's the fire? But as many people may have not. They've gone, well, okay, well, I see the rules for fire, and it'll come up if it comes up. In my mind, when designing it, I didn't really occur to me. In my mind, the Bone Marshes came across as more sun-parched. It wasn't a constant state of fire in so much as it's simply sun-parched and therefore lacking in water. That didn't necessarily mean brush fires, although it does in a certain few hexes, which you added. So I thought, well, there you go. So that was but then of course I have the benefit of reading and rereading it as part of the design process. So of course I've had time to kind of analyze it at length, and I haven't played it. So my experience of that is sort of skewed. But yeah, that would be my thoughts on the subject.
Yeah, I think I'm sort of on the same page as you. Is like, it really is sort of a cost benefit analysis.
Yeah.
And out of this list of a dozen, maybe we'll decide it's worth doing these 4, and then that's it.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll type up a blog on all the suggestions I've gotten back and which ones we decided to or decided not to do.
And we could state our reasons why. After all, we've got nothing to hide in this respect.
That might be an interesting bit of content. But
I think it would. Yeah.
But I really appreciate your thoughts on that, Joe. It's interesting because you're going to end up being the one making these changes. So I'm glad that you see the value in them.
Well, of course, in a way, even if I never was to play a game of the Bone Marshes, that's not to say I wouldn't. So for me, as an indie RPG designer, put my hat on. It feels like adding value to this is a good thing, right? Like capital G, capital T, because why not? This is if you're doing it and you're enjoying it, then let's just continue to push those ideas and make these things happen, and get more cool ideas out there.
Yep.
Simple as that.
Yeah, and thanks to Kickstarter and Drive-Thru, it's easier than ever to get your thoughts and your ideas out there. And of course, thanks to all of our incredible backers. If you find a typo, email me at davidshirtawan@gmail.com.
At hotmail.com. Don't do that.
But yeah, that sort of summarizes my thoughts. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about now that Bone Marshes is complete, or?
No, not really. I'm happy with the project, and I'm always keen to do more. If other people want to be involved in similar process, me and or David, that's another thing to get in touch about as well, because I think we've both. I don't want to put words in your mouth, David. I'll speak for myself instead. I'd say, well, I've enjoyed this process immensely, and if you're half as cool as David, or preferably more, then get in touch. Because these are great projects, and if you're considering it, just go for it. It's really, really good. It's a fun process, and it takes a lot of planning. It's not straightforward, but it is good. It's a fun process, and you'll spend. We start to finish. It was just shy of 6 months, really, wasn't it? It was like a 5.
Yep.
I would call it in my mind a 5-month process, give or take a week. I'd say from like middle of 5. Call it 5-month process. So there you are. I'd say that it's a good way to spend your 5 months just working away and just really iterating and cracking on with something that you've got a lot of passion for. And the more of those we see in the wide world, the better. So go to it.
Yep, you can always reach out. I'll put links to Joe's website and mine. We're always open to new projects.
Yep.
Joe is available for design work. He did an excellent job on Bone Marshes. I'm available for writing. I did an excellent job on Bone Marshes.
You did. It's true.
But yeah, thanks again, Joe, for having this meeting and running through this. Maybe we'll do like a year-long review, or I don't know. Maybe we'll do another hangout. But this one was great.
Review. Everyone get ready. It's a 1 year long Twitch stream. We're not going to sleep
be
for a year. Yeah.
24/7.
24/7. Yeah.
But thanks, Joe. Thanks for coming by.
My pleasure. Take care.
Bye.